here at the meeting of the National Society of Professional Surveyors to give a little shout out to the National Geodetic Survey, the forthcoming development implementation of new horizontal and vertical datums for the entire United States. So there's a tremendous amount of new technology that's being developed and used by NGS and land surveyors as they go about their normal daily processes. We thought this was an opportunity, a good opportunity, for us to take a moment and perhaps take a little bit of a step back to get a sense of at least the tools and some description of them that were used by the agency, by the National Geodetic Survey and its predecessor agency, the Coast and Geodetic Survey, over the last 100 years to help bring us the National Spatial Reference System as we know it today. So what you see here laid out are some examples of the various tools, instruments that NGS and Coast and Geodetic Survey use to perform processes such as triangulation to determine horizontal positions, latitude, longitude, state plane coordinates, and leveling to obviously produce heights. And we're also going to share with you the beginnings of the use of the global positioning system. So let me start off with most of the instruments that you see here come from the National Geodetic Survey, from their office in Corbin, Virginia, just a little bit south of Fredericksburg, Virginia. They have a wonderful collection, but unless you happen to go there, you're probably never going to see these things. You won't see them at typically a state surveyors conference. So we're very fortunate that NGS could provide the resources to make these available to us to share with you. So I'll start off on the very end over here with a 1-second theodolite, and this happens to be was made by the company called Bamberg in Germany. It was very similar to the type of theodolite that the Coast and Geodetic Survey would have used roughly about 1870 to 1880. It weighs about 25 pounds, and it required an observer and a recorder, as most do, but the recorder was active in the process of actually making the measurements, as there are 2 eyepieces that have to be read each time you performed an observation, whether it was a horizontal direction or a vertical angle. It was reasonably heavy, and it had a few issues, and it took time for the agency to develop new techniques, new tools. And that was an ongoing process if we go back before the turn of the last century. Having geodetic instrumentation was very difficult to come by in the United States. Almost all of it was being produced overseas, either in the United Kingdom or in Germany. And the Coast and Geodetic Survey was looking for ways to improve on that, to develop techniques, technologies that were more affordable and more easily developed. So in doing that, they created an office within the Coast and Geodetic Survey that was purely about instrumentation. Now, mind you, at the time, the Coast and Geodetic Survey was not just about geodesy and triangulation or leveling. They also had a very active part in coastal monitoring, developing tools for tide gauges. So the agency was performing a tremendous amount of different work that continuously had to be updated. By roughly about 1910, we see part of that effort come out in this particular instrument, a theodolite. This happens to be a 2/10 second theodolite. It was first order. The design generated by a gentleman, William Parkhurst. It was one of 2 instruments, geodetic instruments, that were designed and produced in the United States. And I believe it's true that they're the only two. You'll see the other one in just a moment. The instrument very much in design, such as the Bamberg, in that it has 2 micrometers. So you had to have a reader from the observer as well as the recorder. Both of these types of instruments for triangulation was not unusual in the course of performing that triangulation, that the agency would have to build towers, particularly in those days, out of wood, and oftentimes well over 100 feet tall, to get the instruments up and above all the trees and the hills and houses, so that they could make long lines of observation, long line sights, which would often be easily 30 to 50 miles. And right here you see the way they did that. All of these were done at night, using electric lamps by the turn of the last century, using electric lamps. And it was not unusual for somebody who was performing triangulation off these wooden towers, as I said, to be observing another station that would easily be 40 to 50 miles away. It's a little hard to see, but I'll lift it and point it. There's a little hole in the top of this light, and this light would just be hooked up to a series of batteries. That little hole is there for a very specific reason, and that is it would not be at all unusual to have 4, 5, or 6 of these lights on a survey mark, pointed in different directions, looking at other stations where somebody was going to have an instrument such as this one, measuring directions to them. So the whole process of triangulation was one in which you're measuring directions, the concept of a triangle being 180 degrees. Of course, in the context of geodesy, you're talking about curvature of the Earth, so you're looking at spherical triangulation. But a typical observer, an easily typical observer, if I put myself in the position of having to be an observer, I'm being told by the chief of party that I'm going to go out to a station and be an observer one night, there could easily be 6 or 7 or 8 other observers who were all going to do the same thing. Our observations would always, not mostly, always be either from the top of a tower, a very rigid tower that we would build in the beginning out of wood, later by the 1920s, 1927 to be exact, built out of steel that you could put up, take down, easily 100 feet tall. And while I would be observing 4 or 5 or 6 other stations, they would be observing me as well. So each one of these stations had to have not only an observer with a very delicate theodolite, but also with lights pointing in all those different directions. The Parkhurst was the standard theodolite for the Coast and Geodetic Survey from roughly about 1915 until 1952, when the agency adopted this instrument made by the Swiss company Wild Herberg. It's the T3. Now, there were a series of theodolites that Wild made, the T1, the T2, the T3, and soon the T4. But the T3 was pretty much the standard in geodetic triangulation from literally the late 30s until triangulation became obsolete in the 1980s with the development of the global positioning system. The T3 has a number of advantages over the Parkhurst, which, as I said, had been the standard. It's a bit lighter. It's about 3 pounds lighter. It's easier to use. You have a single observer and reading a single micrometer, so you don't have to have 2 people reading at the same time. And it was essentially a bulletproof instrument. They could take an incredible amount of abuse. And it's quite a favorite. It's relatively easy to learn how to use, but it does take a little bit of effort. At the same time that Wild was producing the T3, we also see the company Kern, also out of Switzerland, producing a similar kind of instrument, the DKM. This one happens to be a DKM3, which very much like the T3 is a 2/10 second instrument. But it's significantly different in a number of aspects. One is you can see it's smaller. It is not particularly lighter. It's quite a heavy instrument. And unlike the T3 or the Parkhurst or the Bamberg, where the telescope is straight through viewing, as you might see with many refracting telescopes. This one is referred to as a broken telescope. That is, the observer is using an eyepiece which is on the side of the instrument. So you're not looking directly at the object that you're observing to. That takes a little bit of practice to be able to do it right. The T3 really was the standard at the National Geodetic Survey for the last 40 years. Off and on, the Kern would be used as well. Another aspect in triangulation, up until the development of the global positioning system, was in performing network triangulation, you often run into a small problem with the Earth's gravity field. It's referred to as the deflection of the vertical. Now, this webinar does not have the time to go into the details of the deflection of the vertical, but it's an important aspect in the world of geodesy. And until we had tools such as GPS, we relied on purely astronomic observations. Now, in the earliest days, those astronomic observations performed by NGS's predecessor, the Coast and Geodetic Survey and Survey of the Coast, going all the way back to 1807, were performed with significantly large telescopes, referred to as meridian telescopes or transit instruments. Regrettably, we don't have one of those here. They're exceptionally rare, and NGS is not really keen to allow them out of their office. But this instrument, the Wild T4, ultimately became the standard, again, globally for astronomic observations. First of all, it's portable. It may not look portable, and mind you, it is quite heavy. It comes in several boxes. The instrument, with all the pieces, weighs well over 100 pounds, so it might not sound like it's portable. But when you consider the size of the instruments that it was replacing, it is incredibly portable. Now, in this particular setup, you see it on a tripod. It's about 3.5 feet tall. This is for show purposes only. The instrument was almost never used practically in this configuration. The general way it would be used is an aluminum, wood, sometimes a steel tripod that would only be about 2.5 feet tall. And you would build wooden duck boards around it so that as you walked around the instrument, you wouldn't be touching it in any way. And those duck boards would have 2 seats bolted to them because the observer is going to be sitting down for, in many cases, 4, 5, or 6 hours at a night, doing nothing except tracking different stars to determine either astronomic latitude or astronomic longitude, both 2 entirely different procedures, but all well defined using this particular instrument. The overwhelming majority of professional land surveyors never see one of these. They're exceptionally rare. There are only about 1,000 or so of them produced, and they were generally limited to those kinds of institutions that were doing high accuracy geodetic measurements. So in the United States, that would have been the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and to some extent also the U.S. military, the U.S. Defense Department, Defense Mapping Agency, and the Air Force. But you see very, very few of these, and today there are very, very few people left around who know how to observe with them and how to take care of them and perform the correct measurements. So I'll move on a little bit. We talked about horizontal. Now let me talk a little bit, well, I've talked about part of the horizontal. Another aspect of the horizontal is measuring a distance. The concept in triangulation is if I have a triangle and I measure three angles with a tool such as one of these theodolites, I must know at least one distance that's been well measured. And if I know that, I can use generally the law of sines and I can compute the distances of the other two sides. Well, the key is measuring that distance. Up until the advent of the end of World War II, measurements, those distances were measured on the ground, exceptionally laboriously, very time-consuming. At the end of World War II, we see the development of electronic distance measuring instruments, such as the one you see here. Now, there were two styles that came out of this effort. One was measuring distances with microwaves. The instrument was referred to as a tellurometer. The other was with light waves, either infrared or laser. This happens to be a laser that came out of Sweden, known as the geodometer. This happens to be a geodometer Model 4, produced in the mid-60s. It was a very common instrument used in geodetic agencies to measure distances of exceptionally long lines. So if I go back a moment and I resurrect that concept of measuring the distance on the ground, prior to the development of electronic methodologies, measuring a distance on the ground to an extremely high level of positional integrity, which is what's required in the field of geodesy, would often take field crews of numerous people. You might often have 8 or 10 people working on it, and to measure a distance as short as 10 miles, which doesn't sound like much, could easily take certainly days, if not weeks, depending upon weather conditions and a few others. So that limitation of just about 10 miles, that was just about the furthest you could measure with a tape or other instruments on the ground. With the advent of electronic technologies, we now see the capacity to start measuring these things with field units of maybe 3 or 4 people instead of 15 or 20, and easily measuring distances 35, 40, 50 miles or more. This particular instrument is referred to by the National Geodetic Survey as Big Red. That's because the National Geodetic Survey's office outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, had gone in and modified, had upgraded, if you will, the laser in this instrument to be able to measure fairly exceptional distances. And this specific one was part of a survey that measured a line out of Yuma, Arizona that was 94 miles long. And they actually got a full geodetic reception. It was quite an amazing feat. I wish I had the pictures to show not only the instrument that was being used, but the field crew and the number of reflectors that they had to have on the other side. It was quite an amazing thing. But this instrument, while exceptionally powerful, had significant limitations in that, first of all, they were expensive. So what you found is that measuring such distances was, to one extent or another, limited to almost exclusively governmental institutions or research institutions, which had a significant amount of money to buy these instruments. I hope you can get a sense that with the numerous dials and switches that you see here, it took a fair amount of training to learn how to use this instrument. So again, this process was limited to a fairly small group of individuals to be able to measure distances very, very long and to a very high degree of integrity. That all changes in 1969. A company known as Hewlett-Packard, who had been around a very long time, Hewlett-Packard introduced an electronic distance measuring instrument. This happens to be the second generation. This is a Hewlett-Packard HP 3805A. It's the second generation, but the first generation, released in 1969, was moderately priced. It's significantly lighter than something like this Model 4 geodometer. I'll turn it around. You can see the face on it. It's simple. It's very simple for the average person, average surveyor especially, to learn how to perform a measurement. And the average surveyor didn't need to measure lines 30, 40, or 50 miles. 5, 6, 7 miles, even upwards of 10 miles could be done to an exceptionally high degree of integrity. I personally, and it's just my own personal opinion, I personally credit this one instrument, I call it the game changer, because it put the capability of making geodetic measurements now in the hands of the average land surveyor, which has multiplied to this day with new technologies. And so I look at this as the singular instrument that actually started that whole environment that we enjoy to this day. So quite an instrument, quite an amazing feat that I think from Hewlett-Packard. They don't often get the credit they deserve for it. So I've talked about the horizontal aspects of some of these instruments. Just as importantly, in fact, more importantly, because everybody ultimately wants to know heights, where water and other fluids are going to go. So the determination of accurate heights comes from the process of leveling, which is a very common process in surveying and engineering. In geodetic measurements, you want to take it to another higher level. And the beginning of leveling in the United States actually starts in the 1840s. Very, very short level line that was performed by the Coast Survey up along the up in New York, and it didn't last very long. But by 1870, the agency, the Coast and Geodetic Survey, now realized we needed accurate heights across the country. So they began a leveling program that started in a little place called Hagerstown, Maryland, and ran across the country as the first set of high accuracy heights to be determined anywhere in the United States. And from that beginnings in 1877, that process has exploded. Up until recently, and when I say recently, the last 15 years or so, all leveling was done with instruments that were optical in nature. That is, you had to have an observer who was actually looking through the instrument to perform the measurements. Now, you only see a part of it here because when leveling, you also have to have a level rod, and it takes up a lot of space, so we didn't bring a level rod here. But surveyors will understand the process. So this is one of those two instruments that was designed and manufactured exclusively in the United States. So it's called the Fisher level. It was the standard for the Coast and Geodetic Survey from roughly about 1900 until about, the middle part of the 1950s. Then we start to see improvements in the leveling instrument. Now, we could have brought out a half a dozen different instruments that show that evolution, but given our time and space, I limited to one. And again, in my humble opinion, I find this particular instrument to be probably the finest optical level that's ever been produced. It's a Zeiss Jena Ni002 level. It was produced in East Germany, so during those very difficult times of the Cold War. So actually accessing them, being able to buy them, was a very difficult process for agencies in the United States, but we got it done. This is a very unique kind of instrument because with a standard level, as most surveyors would recognize, you have two rodmen, so you have one in front of you, one behind you, and you're going to make an observation through the telescope of the level to one rod. Then you're going to turn the instrument 180 degrees to look at the other rodman, which means the observer has to move around the instrument. And in doing so, you impart, even though it's small, you impart motion to the instrument. This instrument, lovely, the observer never has to move. The instrument itself simply swivels, and the eyepiece will swivel to meet the location of the observer for that level line. It was a wonderful, wonderful tool. Like I said, I think it was pretty much a good standard right up until the advent of now what we refer to as digital barcode levels, which also are incredibly important and accurate instruments. So as we move forward now, we come by the early 80s, we're already dealing with space-based positioning, and a lot of surveyors not really aware of that. From the first satellite that went up, Sputnik, the United States already saw the advantage of having satellites in space that would allow us to determine our position on the ground. And there were a number of satellite systems that went up. The one that was the greatest impact was referred to as the transit Doppler. It used the Doppler signal of a satellite to determine positions. They were low Earth orbit, and they had a lot of issues with the Earth's gravity field. But by the late 70s, we see the design of the technology that has just exploded our entire concept of positioning, and that is GPS, the Global Positioning System. The first one put up, GPS put up, by the United States military. Today we have other constellations from other countries, and users around the world enjoy the capacity of GPS. Surveyors certainly, but anyone who has a cell phone has access to GNSS technologies. Well, it has made such a dynamic imprint in how we go about collecting geospatial data. We thought in this particular event, it's nice to take a look at the very first real active GPS receivers, and that's what you see here. So on this side right here is the antenna and what they call a ground plane for the first receiver. So the receiver itself, the blue box that you'll see here in a second, referred to as the Micrometer V1000. The agency, National Geodetic Survey, acquired these in 1981 and produced the first practical GPS survey anywhere in the world in 1983, a little place called Summit County, Ohio, just a little piece of history. But a point to notice, the antenna and ground plane weighs about 35 pounds. The receiver weighs probably about 150 pounds. And we had to put it in the back of a Suburban to carry it around. Today, we enjoy instruments that are just a couple of pounds, and you can throw them over your shoulder and go anywhere you want to. These instruments, when they were new, cost $250,000 a piece, $250,000 a piece. An incredible amount of money to be able to determine positioning integrity at the levels of just a couple of centimeters. So it shows how far we have come since the 80s in our capacity to develop new technologies to access these satellite systems and enjoy incredible amounts of positional integrity, both in the practical sense of geodesy and land surveying, as well as navigation and just homeowners being able to use these technologies. I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion of some of these historic instruments. And if you have any questions about them, you can feel free to reach out to the National Society of Professional Surveyors, and they'll be more than happy to share information with you. Thank you.